They don't leave because they don't feel anything. They leave because what they feel becomes too real to stay the same. An avoidant is often scared of love in a way most people don't immediately recognize, because the truth is, they don't usually panic when they're losing someone they don't care about. The shift happens when the connection becomes real enough to actually change something inside them. That's when fear starts to show up. But this fear doesn't look obvious. Avoidant individuals rarely display anxiety in the dramatic ways people expect. They don't always cry, chase, plead, or openly express fear. Sometimes it shows up as slower replies after a deeply intimate moment. Sometimes it looks like them suddenly becoming busy right after emotional closeness. Other times it's them staring at a message for a long time, typing and deleting, not because they don't care, but because they care more than they can comfortably handle. That's what makes this so mentally confusing. The deeper their feelings go, the more their internal defense system activates. And if you've ever experienced someone being fully present one moment and emotionally distant the next, this hits in a very personal way. Because what it creates is the feeling of being chosen and pushed away at the same time. They pull you close enough to feel significant, and then step back right when your nervous system starts to relax into them. And what makes it even harder is that they often don't fully understand their own reactions either. A lot of people misunderstand avoidant behavior as confidence, independence, or emotional strength. But emotional distance isn't always security. Sometimes it's protection built over time, usually after learning that depending on others doesn't feel safe. So when real emotional connection enters their life, it doesn't just bring warmth, it creates exposure. Suddenly, there is someone whose opinion matters, someone who can hurt them, someone who can see behind the mask they've learned to maintain. And that changes everything. What once felt light starts feeling emotionally heavy. And emotional weight is something avoidant psychology struggles to hold comfortably. Their nervous system starts treating closeness as risk instead of comfort. The more emotionally close someone gets, the more alert their internal system becomes. Not because the connection is wrong, but because intimacy itself feels overwhelming. Deep down, many avoidants associate closeness with loss of control, disappointment, or emotional dependence. So even when they genuinely want connection, another part of them is already scanning for distance. This is where the contradiction begins. They can care deeply about you and still feel overwhelmed by how much they care. You often notice the shift when they start monitoring themselves around you. In the beginning, they seem relaxed, natural, even secure. But as attachment grows, their behavior becomes more calculated. They pause before speaking, soften their texts, and become more controlled in how much emotion they show. They replay conversations afterward, wondering if they revealed too much. They want to respond warmly, but choose something safer instead. The warmth doesn't disappear, but it gets filtered through caution. Even positive emotional experiences can make them uncomfortable, because being understood, appreciated, or emotionally seen creates intimacy. And intimacy is exactly what activates both their desire and their fear at the same time. This is why avoidants often seem more emotionally available in casual dynamics than in serious ones. Casual connection doesn't threaten their defenses. Real emotional attachment does. Then comes the moment that confuses people the most, the shift after intimacy. A deep conversation, emotional vulnerability, closeness that finally feels real. For a moment, it seems like the barrier is gone. But afterward, something changes. They become distant, quieter, less emotionally accessible. Almost like they've pulled away overnight. This happens because closeness creates emotional activation they weren't prepared to sustain. What feels bonding to most people can feel destabilizing to them afterward. Their system tries to restore balance by creating distance again, not always consciously. Sometimes they miss you while simultaneously pulling away. That's the contradiction. The moment meant something real, but its intensity triggers self-protection. This is also why avoidant patterns feel hot and cold when attachment deepens. One part of them wants connection, safety, and emotional closeness. Another part fears dependence, vulnerability, and emotional loss of control. So the relationship becomes an internal push and pull between those two states. One moment they are engaged, affectionate, emotionally present. The next, they retreat into themselves without being able to fully explain why. From the outside, it feels personal, but internally, it's often about regulation, not rejection. Closeness builds emotional pressure, and distance becomes the way they release it. And over time, that cycle becomes visible in small ways. Shorter replies, slightly colder energy, moments of emotional withdrawal, sudden need for space, stress, or solitude. Not always dramatic, but noticeable if you're emotionally invested. What makes it painful is the timing. Distance often shows up right when things start feeling stable, right when connection deepens, right when it finally feels safe. Because for them, the closer it gets, the more real it becomes. And the more real it becomes, the harder it is to stay in it without fear taking over. Expectations begin to feel real. Dependency starts to feel real. Even the possibility of getting hurt starts to feel real. And in that moment, space becomes the nervous system's way of trying to breathe again. Distance gives them temporary relief from emotional intensity they don't yet know how to sit with directly. But on the other side, for the person involved, it often feels like emotional whiplash. Because while you're moving closer, they're unconsciously stepping back just to calm the internal alarm that closeness activated in them. What makes this especially painful is that avoidant individuals often don't realize how much reassurance disappears the moment they pull away. From their perspective, they are simply trying to stabilize themselves. But for the other person, it can feel like love is slowly fading in real time. And this is where silence becomes important to understand. Silence in avoidant behavior is rarely empty. That's a common misunderstanding. More often, it is full of internal noise they cannot easily translate into words. Overthinking, emotional conflict, anxiety, guilt, longing, and fear all at once. Sometimes they go quiet because responding emotionally feels too exposing in that moment. Sometimes they tell themselves they need to regain control before they reconnect. And sometimes they avoid responding simply because they know the conversation waiting for them requires vulnerability they don't feel ready to offer yet. But while all of that is happening internally, the experience on the receiving end is completely different. It turns into confusion, self-doubt, emotional overthinking, and a deep sense of abandonment. From their side, the avoidant believes they are preventing emotional chaos by stepping away temporarily. But for the other person, the silence itself becomes the chaos, especially when the avoidant eventually returns acting calm, casual, and unaffected, as if nothing happened at all. What's actually happening is emotional compartmentalization. Avoidants often separate and store overwhelming emotions in order to cope. They disconnect, regulate internally, and only return once the emotional intensity feels manageable again. The problem is not the need for space itself. The problem is the lack of explanation. Without context, the other person is left trying to decode emotional patterns that were never clearly communicated. And one of the most confusing experiences in this dynamic is how deeply intimate moments can be followed by sudden emotional normalcy, almost as if nothing significant occurred. You can have one of the most vulnerable conversations of your life with them. They open up in ways they usually don't. They reveal fears, past wounds, insecurities, and emotions they normally keep hidden. For a brief moment, it feels like emotional walls have completely dropped. Then the next day arrives and they seem different, more distant, more casual, almost emotionally untouched by what just happened. That contrast can feel disorienting because it makes you question whether the moment meant anything at all. But often, that emotional reset is not proof that it didn't matter. In many cases, it's actually a sign that it mattered too much. Avoidant individuals struggle to stay in prolonged emotional exposure because vulnerability quickly begins to feel like emotional dependence. So after opening up, their system instinctively pulls them back toward emotional balance. Acting casual again is a way of regaining control. It reduces the intensity of feelings that suddenly became too loud to sit with. If you look closely, you'll often notice a pattern. They tend to appear the most emotionally detached right after the most emotionally meaningful moments. Not before them, but after them. Because emotional closeness doesn't disappear immediately, it lingers, and they need time to regulate it internally. This is also why avoidants sometimes test relationships once attachment deepens. Most of these behaviors aren't fully conscious, but they still influence the dynamic. They might withdraw slightly just to see how you respond. They may become inconsistent to observe whether your interest changes. At a deeper level, they are asking an internal question. If I stop maintaining closeness perfectly, will I still be accepted? And underneath that is an even deeper fear. If I fully allow myself to attach, will I lose my freedom, my emotional safety, or my sense of self? So they observe, they track reactions, they look for signs of control, pressure, emotional punishment, or conditional love. To them, this is not inconsistency, it is risk assessment. The irony is that these tests often create the very insecurity they are trying to avoid. But fear does not behave logically, it behaves defensively. And this becomes even more visible when affection increases. Compliments that would normally feel comforting can make them uncomfortable. Deep reassurance can trigger withdrawal instead of comfort. Genuine admiration can lead them to deflect, minimize, or shift the subject entirely. Not because they don't feel it, but because feeling it so directly can feel overwhelming. And for someone who loves openly, this reaction can feel deeply confusing. It raises a simple question. Why would anyone resist the very thing most people are searching for? But for avoidant individuals, being emotionally seen too clearly doesn't feel comforting, it feels exposing. Affection removes the emotional distance they unconsciously rely on to feel protected. When someone looks at them with genuine love, it becomes harder for them to hide behind independence, logic, or emotional self-sufficiency. It creates a moment where they can no longer avoid the reality that they genuinely matter to someone else. And that realization carries weight. Because love is not just comfort for them, it is responsibility, emotional exposure, and risk. The more loved they feel, the more aware they become of what could be lost. So instead of fully relaxing into affection, part of them instinctively tightens. Not because love is unwanted, but because it touches emotional layers they have spent years learning how to avoid. At the core of this is a fear that quietly shapes much of their behavior, the fear of losing themselves. Many people assume avoidants are simply afraid of commitment, but commitment itself is rarely the true issue. The deeper fear is emotional engulfment, the sense that love might slowly consume their independence, blur their identity, or trap them inside emotional expectations they don't feel equipped to carry indefinitely. This fear is usually not random. It is often shaped over time through experiences where closeness felt unsafe, where emotional needs were dismissed, criticized, or met with inconsistency. Over time, they may have learned that depending on others leads to disappointment, or that expressing needs creates discomfort. So when they begin to truly care about someone, another layer activates beneath the connection. They start thinking in ways they might never say aloud. Will I still feel like myself? Will I eventually fail this person? What if I can't meet their emotional needs? What if love slowly turns into pressure? And that creates internal conflict, because they do want connection. They want closeness, stability, affection, and emotional safety. But they also fear what that level of closeness might demand from them. This is why relationships can feel overwhelming once they start becoming emotionally serious. The connection stops feeling temporary and starts feeling permanent. And permanence introduces responsibility, emotional exposure, and vulnerability in a way that can trigger withdrawal, even when feelings are strong. What makes this even more complex is that avoidants often care far more than they openly show. One of the clearest signs of emotional attachment is how much attention they quietly give without expressing it directly. They remember small details you mentioned in passing. They notice subtle changes in your mood before you say anything. They recall your habits, preferences, routines, and emotional patterns. They may reread conversations, revisit memories, or think about interactions long after they've acted emotionally distant. This matters because avoidants rarely invest that level of attention where there is no emotional significance. Their attachment often exists beneath expression rather than through it. But because they struggle to show vulnerability openly, these signs are often missed. The other person looks for reassurance in direct emotional language, while the avoidant is expressing care through observation, memory, and quiet consistency. And this restraint is not accidental. It is usually rooted in earlier experiences where vulnerability didn't feel safe. For many avoidants, emotional expression was not met with comfort. It may have been ignored, criticized, or treated as weakness. They may have learned early on that being emotionally independent was safer than being emotionally open, so they adapted. They learned to survive by reducing emotional reliance on others. And those survival strategies don't simply disappear when love enters their life. That is why avoidants can genuinely crave intimacy, while also resisting it at the same time. Their nervous system still associates deep vulnerability with emotional risk, even when the present relationship is safe. So, when closeness increases, old patterns activate automatically. They pull back. They intellectualize emotions instead of expressing them. They distract themselves with work, routines, or responsibilities. They create space to reduce internal pressure. And often, they dislike themselves for it, because part of them understands they are hurting someone they care about. But emotional conditioning built over years doesn't shut off easily through awareness alone. The body reacts before logic can intervene. This is why increasing closeness can sometimes produce increasing resistance. Casual connection feels manageable because it carries low emotional stakes, but stable, consistent intimacy introduces emotional permanence, and permanence brings vulnerability, responsibility, and fear of loss. The paradox is that safety itself can feel unfamiliar. Stability can feel more intense than chaos because chaos at least allows emotional distance. Stability removes distraction and leaves them face to face with intimacy they don't fully know how to regulate. And that's often when the cycle becomes most visible. Just as things begin to feel safe, they may start pulling away. They might become more critical, more distant, or emotionally inconsistent. Small issues begin to feel bigger. Conversations lose warmth, or they shut down without clear explanation. From the outside, it feels like rejection, but internally, it is often an attempt to regain control before emotional vulnerability deepens further than they can comfortably manage. If the relationship starts to feel emotionally serious, part of them begins searching, sometimes unconsciously, for reasons to step back before attachment goes too deep. Because full attachment doesn't just mean closeness for them, it means full emotional risk. So the mind starts scanning for exits. Problems become easier to focus on than fear. Doubt becomes easier to sit with than vulnerability. And distance starts to feel safer than surrender. The painful irony is that avoidant patterns often don't come from feeling nothing, but from feeling too much without knowing how to hold it safely. And in that overwhelm, pulling away can feel like the only way to regain control. But what's rarely understood is that distance doesn't erase their emotions. It changes how they surface. When an avoidant is emotionally close to someone they care about, their system is often overloaded. There's pressure from expectations, vulnerability, emotional exposure, and the fear of losing control. In that state, they tend to suppress, compartmentalize, or distract themselves just to stay regulated. But once distance enters the picture, that pressure temporarily drops. And in that quieter space, emotions they couldn't fully process during closeness begin to surface more clearly. Suddenly, they miss conversations they acted indifferent toward. They replay moments they seemed unaffected in. They think about your presence, your voice, your patterns, and the sense of emotional safety they didn't fully acknowledge while it was happening. It becomes almost paradoxical. Sometimes they are able to feel love more clearly in absence than in intimacy, because absence removes the immediate fear that comes with vulnerability. But this creates a painful contradiction. The same person they struggled to stay close to is often the one they miss most when they're gone. And by the time clarity arrives internally, the emotional damage in the relationship may already be done. This is also why avoidant behavior is so often misread as simple lack of interest. And to be fair, sometimes it genuinely is disinterest. Not every emotionally distant person is secretly afraid of love, but there is a clear difference between indifference and fear. Indifference is flat, it's consistent. Emotionally, it doesn't fluctuate much. Fear creates contradiction. An avoidant who is emotionally attached but afraid often shows inconsistency instead. They pull close, then retreat. They act engaged, then distant. They remember details while maintaining emotional distance. They feel overwhelmed after intimacy rather than during neutral interactions. The inconsistency is not randomness, it's internal conflict. And one of the most painful parts of this dynamic is that avoidants sometimes give brief access to emotional depth they cannot sustain. Moments where the defenses drop, where the connection feels real, where you see softness, fear, attachment, even longing. And then, just as quickly, the wall returns. That shift is not always manipulation. Sometimes it's the nervous system pulling someone back into what feels emotionally survivable. When avoidants begin to realize they are actually in love, the experience is often far more intense internally than what they show outwardly. But because they tend to intellectualize emotions, they don't always recognize it immediately. Eventually, something changes. The person becomes emotionally central. Thoughts of loss appear more often. Jealousy becomes more noticeable. Silence from that person starts to land differently. The connection begins to feel permanent instead of temporary. And permanence is where things become overwhelming. Because now it's no longer just attraction or attachment, it starts to feel like emotional dependence. Love stops being abstract and starts feeling real enough to threaten their internal sense of safety. At that point, different avoidants respond differently. Some try to move closer. Some pull away harder. Some become emotionally confused, caught between longing and fear at the same time. They may crave reassurance while simultaneously resisting it. They may want closeness but sabotage it when it appears. And many of them quietly grieve relationships even while still inside them, because they are already anticipating the vulnerability that love demands. Still, avoidant patterns are not permanent identities. They are learned protective systems, not fixed emotional destinies. The real shift doesn't come from love alone. It comes from awareness, from recognizing the pattern instead of being controlled by it, from learning that vulnerability is not the same as emotional loss, from understanding that healthy love doesn't erase identity, it doesn't trap freedom, and it doesn't require emotional self-abandonment. Avoidant healing begins when emotional connection stops being seen as danger and starts being understood as something that can exist without control, punishment, or fear. That requires consistency, safety, and communication that doesn't turn emotional expression into threat. It also requires learning that distance doesn't have to mean disappearance, and closeness doesn't have to mean losing oneself. Because underneath all of it, the core conflict is rarely about not wanting love. It's about what love has historically felt like to their nervous system. So when an avoidant seems scared to love you, it is often not just about you. It is about what your presence activates inside them. You reach places they learned to keep shut for survival: dependency, vulnerability, longing, fear, emotional need. And once those layers are activated, they can't always return to emotional numbness the same way again. That's why love changes them so deeply, even when they try to act unaffected. It pulls them into an internal conflict between protection and surrender, between staying and running, between who they had to become to survive and who they actually are underneath it all. And if you've ever been close to that kind of dynamic, you already know how heavy that tension can feel. Loving someone who is still learning how to stay with what they feel. But understanding this doesn't mean accepting inconsistency that erases your own emotional needs. Real connection only works when both people are willing to face themselves honestly. And for avoidance, that turning point begins when the question stops being, "How do I avoid getting hurt?" and slowly becomes something more honest. What kind of love is possible if I stop running from it? Because in the end, love doesn't ask them to become someone else. It asks them to finally stop disappearing from the parts of themselves that were always meant to be felt, held, and understood.